going on, everybody? Welcome. Friday morning. Those of you watching on YouTube, my hair is showing showing a little crazy. It's like I got a haircut. I don't know about you, but I'm like a child now that I don't have to go into the office and be a serious person, other than I guess on this podcast. But let's face it, no offense to you guys out there, but I don't know how many like people care about the aesthetics of this. I got a lot more listens than views, so that helps. Um, they say a face made for radio was an old thing. I have a haircut made for podcasting as opposed to YouTube streaming. But anyway, let's talk week 6 NFL. I did not write a weekly commentary this week, but I do have some things I want to talk about. I kind of squeezed in some commentary on quarterback rankings, what's going on with the Ringer. I know I've talked about Ruiz and the Ringer a few times, but I don't know. I just think it's a very illustrative example of rankings, what goes wrong, why you can't explain it away necessarily in a great way, why you have to have some sort of systematic way of doing it in order to get people on the same page and at least have some understanding of what's going on. And then also an example of, bad use of stats, I would say. Or you don't respect the stats. If you don't respect the stats, then and what they're telling you as far as a base truth is concerned, then you're just manipulating and using them to back up what you believe is to be base truth. In other words, your own opinion. I'll talk about that. Also, as part of the weekly commentary is sort of review, I want to talk about a clip that I've seen from Kevin Clark's podcast with Mitchell Schwartz talking about the most valuable offensive lineman he believes in the NFL. I think there's some interesting takeaways from that. And then lastly, on the Wharton Moneyball podcast this week, Cade Massey, I would say friend of the pod, but I don't think he's actually been on this pod. I have interviewed him before, and I have spoken with him a number of times. Wharton professor, co-author of the groundbreaking Loser's Curse study on NFL draft value. He interviewed Luke Bourne, who has a history as an academic working with NBA data, worked for the Sacramento Kings for a while, kind of decided at that point that he has to be part of ownership in order to do things, which I think is a really good point. I kind of feel similarly myself, although I'll never be part of ownership like he is. And he found some people and some capital and Billy Bean and others to go ahead and purchase some teams, which then he could have influence on a couple of European soccer clubs. But he has some good clips. I'll share one clip from the interview that I thought was particularly good, but also talk about some other things that he said as part of that interview. And then, of course, we'll get into week 6 and your questions and everything else. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments here. I'm not going to necessarily get to them for a while on YouTube streaming. Just entitle them with Q&A at the beginning. It'll help me sort through in case people start going back and forth about, whether Lamar Jackson should be a running back or something like that in the comments. All right. First, we'll start with Thursday night. Not a great game. I only watched the first half. Didn't seem like I missed that much in the second half, although things may have gotten a little bit better offensively for the Broncos, but they couldn't get much worse based upon what was happening in the first half. Okay, so a few things that I think are important to talk about in this one. And let me go ahead for those of you watching here and bring up my advanced review of this game. As you see, I got Travis Kelce on here as the main picture. He was the man, especially in the first half there, with over 100 yards receiving in the first half. And let's go through the headline numbers. So 19-8 final score. I had it 26-19, which is a little bit more narrow, not hugely more narrow. Basically, we're talking about adding 9 points to the Broncos score and then adding 7 points to the Chiefs score. Both teams were less impotent offensively than their final scores, even though you could say the Broncos were pretty impotent offensively. So that might be a bit of a surprise. But let me just go into the whys here. So the whys, success rate wise, the Chiefs are actually over 50% success rate, Broncos at 44.2%. I've seen some other metrics that have them closer to 45 each, but basically it was kind of close between the two teams as far as their success rate is concerned. There wasn't really an advantage on 3rd and 4th down. Both teams were bad though on 3rd and 4th down, and that's what helped converting those. That's what helped hold down their final scores, and we'll talk about that. And then the Chiefs had a bit of a disadvantage here when it came to special teams and penalties. But the big thing is the turnover advantage that the Chiefs had in this game with 2 Russell Wilson interceptions and a fumble in there. Where Mahomes did have an interception also, but net, it was much more costly when it came to the Broncos' mistakes. So first of all, let's talk about the 3rd and 4th down conversion success rate sort of things. Okay, I think it's very difficult, and this is why I'll talk about this in a little bit with the Luke Bourne stuff and his interview, where he talks about in his interview that he likes to see the stats first because he believes, at least if they're well-maintained stats, and I think, I don't know, I'm sure whatever stats he's looking at with all the resources he has, he owns Zealous Analytics, also this big company where I think they have something like 60 employees crunching numbers, and that's a big part of crunching the numbers for the teams that he's a part owner of. So I'm sure he has better stats than I do. Okay, to look at. More accurate, more ground truth sort of stats. But he believes the stats to be more ground truth than the game, than watching the game. I think that's also true. He says that he likes to watch the games for his own teams. One of the things that he does to help cut down on some of the noise and effects and stresses of the biases that human beings generally have is he looks at the stats first before he watches the game. Now, I didn't do this for the Chiefs Broncos games, but I have a kind of a good intuitive understanding of these things. So if you watched the game last night, you would just say, oh my God, this Broncos offense is so bad. And in the first half, I'll give it to you. They didn't really stretch the field at all. I think Russell Wilson had something like a 1.5 yard ADOT or something like that. Now, he actually ended up with a bigger ADOT on the game than Patrick Mahomes. I mean, maybe we should discount that some because it was in effective garbage time, but still, it happened. But what we end up seeing a lot, and this comes also to some reactions I saw to the Jags-Bills game, like some very positive reactions to the Jags versus the Bills in their London game last week, where, it's just one team converting 3rd downs and another team doesn't. And in this game, it was both teams not converting 3rd down, where when you watch that and a team, takes a sack on 4th and short or on 3rd and short, I think Russ was taking some sacks, just not completing passes. It looks almost faded, and it looks like some sort of fundamental flaw in the team when you look at it in this one game basis. When you look at this one game last night with this Broncos offense in particular, you would say, you know what, these guys could just never convert a 3rd down. They're just fundamentally broken because of the results of what we saw in the game and the fact they were 4 of 10 on 3rd down. Actually, the Chiefs were 4 of 13, which I think is interesting. But the Broncos had much shorter 3rd downs. They were just not converting these 3rd downs. They had a 54% expected conversion rate on 3rd down because of how short these 3rd downs were. So they were 14% under expectation. But anyway, so you're watching this, you're just like, man, this team just cannot convert. They're fundamentally that bad. But the reality is, no, they just had a bad game converting 3rd downs. These very high leverage plays, these plays that allowed them to extend drives and score points. You convert a few of those in one direction versus another, and I'm only talking about a handful that really matters and has a huge impact. I mean, these 3rd down conversions, the delta on EPA are multiple points on each one of these. So if you convert a few more 3rd downs than you should have, all of a sudden we're talking about 8, 9 more points in EPA than you would have, just based upon a few plays. So again, I think people watching the game last night would have had this assumption that the Denver offense is completely broken, versus the ground truth of the numbers is, oh, you know what? 44% success rate, not good, not bad. Underperformed on 3rd down, turned over the ball way too much, which, is a problem. Turnovers is another thing where when you watch the game, you think, oh man, like that had to be a turnover. It was such a bad play. These teams have to be so mistake prone. But the reality is, of course, more than half of turnovers are just noisy, especially interceptions, especially fumble recovery luck. So that's just something to keep in mind here for why my adjusted score has this as being a closer game than it may have seemed otherwise. When we get into the offensive efficiency percentiles, these are just the straight up numbers. So they're going to include the turnovers, they're going to include the lack of third down. The Chiefs are still pretty good passing the ball. 67th percentile is their pass efficiency versus only 6th percentile in their run efficiency. Now, that run efficiency includes a wacky fourth down fake field goal conversion attempt by Reed. Like the guy finally goes for it on fourth down and he decides to do some nonsense like that. Like a tush push from 2 yards away, from a yard and a half away, whatever it was. Like, you have Patrick Mahomes. Just use the offense, people. Also in this game, and again, it didn't really matter in this particular game, but there were 2 other times that the Chiefs had the ball 4th and 3 on the Broncos side of the field. Once they decided to kick a field goal, another time they decided to punt. You know, I mean, they easily won this game, so not the biggest deal, but I don't like, whatever. Andy Reid's being Andy Reid. That's what he does. And if you look at kind of like all the plays in this game, you just see like red for the most impactful plays. So the most impactful plays, what I do is I look at the absolute value of EPA, gained or lost, the absolute value, and I rank order them. And if you look at the top 10 plays in the game, the top 6 and the top 7 out of 8 are all negative. So not great. All negative plays by EPA. You have 2 Russell Wilson interceptions, a Samaje Perine fumble, which, came somewhat late in the game. So I guess there was some like theoretical chance that the Broncos could come back, but they didn't even lose that much win probability on that one. Only 1.3% win probability lost because it was so late in the game. We have the Patrick Mahomes interception. We have the Noah Gray attempted tush push. You have a Russell Wilson sack on 4th and 3. And then you skip down a couple of plays and you have Kadarius Toney rushing attempt on 3rd and 1 that failed. Now, the most positive play of the game, despite the fact that there were so many throws to Travis Kelce, and the most positive play, and this is like Patrick Mahomes doing his thing, was a scramble for 15 yards on 3rd and 11. Now, they're up 16-0, so it didn't make that big of a difference from a win probability standpoint. But again, 2.6 EPA on that one scramble from Patrick Mahomes. So that's what he's good at. I think this was an unfortunate game perception-wise, but maybe fortunate for us who don't buy too much into island game performances, perception-wise for Russell Wilson and Sean Payton, because everyone loves to dunk on both of these two. Like, I mentioned before, like, you can basically just say whatever you want about Russell Wilson now, and now Sean Payton too. And it's all fair game to dunk on these guys. And it's probably like there's a bunch of people dunking on the fact that going into the game, people were pointing to Russell Wilson's stats versus Patrick Mahomes and saying, hey, he doesn't look that bad versus Patrick Mahomes. Now, some people are doing some bad use of stats, quarterback rating, things that exclude sacks, where Mahomes is so much better than Russell Wilson. But I will say, it wasn't like the stats people were using were that awful as far as the differential between Wilson and Patrick Mahomes going into the game. All these things that people are dunking on because of this one island game performance, as if that was really encapsulate how they've been playing this year. And I get it. Wilson probably hasn't been as good as his stats, and Patrick Mahomes has probably been better than his stats. That's definitely true. But still, going into the game, Wilson was ranked in the top 10 in EPA per play. I think he was 8th in EPA per play by my numbers. I've seen him lower somewhere else. I'm not sure what the differential is. He's going to fall. He's going to fall out of the top 10 after this game. But again, looking at the numbers going into this game, he was in the top 10. He was, a few ranks below Mahomes, but not severely below Mahomes. He was 16th in PFF passing grade, so not great, but only slightly worse than Justin Herbert by that same metric, and better than Dak Prescott by that same metric. I think Mahomes was 7th or 8th. So Mahomes is not having an outstanding year by any means by these different metrics. So yeah, Russell Wilson wasn't just as good as Mahomes, but people acting like last night's performance was typical of what we've seen from Russell Wilson this year is also incorrect. This game by EPA per play, this was the worst game that Russell Wilson has had with the Broncos, period. So even going back to his dumpster fire of a 2022 season, he was actually worse in this game than he had been in any game during that season. So this was like the bottom range of outcomes for Wilson. But when people watch Island games, they say, oh, this is just like typical. Everything, we're just going to project everything, all of our confirmation bias onto this one game. And again, well, we'll see. We'll see if they can turn things around or not. But how Wilson has been playing this year has been more similar to pre-2019 Wilson, where he had good efficiency, not great grading. For some reason in 2019 and 2020, his grading went through the roof, and I don't know why. Maybe he was really playing that much and throwing the ball that much better. Where his efficiency actually didn't go up that much. Like his EPA per play didn't go up that much, but his grading went up that much. And now he's fallen off back to a stance where he's kind of like good, not great EPA per play and middling grading, which is kind of where he was for most of the early part of his career when he was efficient and they're doing well as a team with a good defense and all that sort of stuff. But the overall numbers, Wilson lost 0.37 EPA per play. His completion percentage over expected, this is also a big issue, negative 12%. But again, his ADOT was 5.3. It ended up being 5.3. Now, there's a lot of chucking it up at the end there that didn't matter. But Patrick Mahomes, only 4 ADOT. So, I still think there are things to worry about when it comes to the Chiefs offense. That may be a bigger takeaway to me somewhat than what even happened with the Broncos offense, because the Broncos offense just fell apart with mistakes. But this Chiefs offense, I don't know, man. 4 ADOT, Patrick Mahomes, he's kind of in the mid-range of the top 10 in EPA per play. He's doing that through rushing and scrambling, being able to contribute in that manner there and not making mistakes, but definitely not like a high-flying type of offense that you would hope for the Chiefs going forward. So that's basically what I would take away from a lot of this game is, good performance by the Chiefs defense, which has been better this year. A little bit worrying that the offense for the Chiefs is still struggling a bit. And, the Broncos, everything's falling apart, but probably not as bad as you would think based upon the numbers. Now, I'm going to start here with kind of some things that are going on during the week that I want to talk about. I'm going to start here with a Mitchell Schwartz quote. I don't want to go through the whole thing because it's long, but I'll share it from Kevin Clark's Twitter here that he has it because he's interviewing him for his podcast with Omaha Productions. And I'll just read out the text here. It says, I asked Mitchell Schwartz who's the most valuable lineman in football, as in which team's system would falter the most without a guy. I like when you add these caveats on there, then I don't know, like which system would falter the most. Again, it's one of these like subjective things that, like, let's just say who's the most valuable, like which team would score fewer points. How about that? Without the lineman versus with the lineman. And his answer was Jason Kelce. So let's listen to some of this answer here, and you can tell me whether or not you agree. But I'll give my spin on it.
Just like if you take the puzzle piece away, nothing can happen. Who is it?
I think it's Jason Kelce. I think everyone kind of thinks it's Trent Williams because left tackle is valuable, and we've seen all the cool highlights of what he can do. And for the Shanahan run scheme in particular, the technique he uses on the backside, where he basically just like chops guys and dumps them and pulls them by the back of the head. Unfortunately, actually injured Vander Esch this past week. Trent kind of did that in space, and unfortunately Vander Esch kind of doinked into Parsons there, and I think they both got hurt. What he can do for that offense is fantastic. I think they can be successful without him. I think Philly is so diverse and they use Kelce in so many different ways, and those 3rd and 4th and 1 pushes are such huge leverage pieces. And I probably wouldn't have said this last year when they were the only team doing the push and we just assumed that it was really easy and you just push the quarterback over the top. But now we see other teams trying it and failing and getting guys injured on the play, and you realize like, maybe there is something to having a center that might be 282 pounds, but he can get underneath guys and get leverage, and then being able to pull him, and obviously the Hurts aspect of what they can do in space using him. And so I do think he's kind of that puzzle piece. And it's interesting because you look back historically, like Teron Armstead to Miami, if you, again, asked me this at the end of last year, you might say him because the numbers with him in and him out are massively different. But this year he's been hurt and they've still been rolling. Tyron Smith was always that guy in Dallas where he goes out and they turn into a 3-13 team and the offense can't succeed. And Dak starts looking, depending on your view on Dak, even more like Dak or even less like Dak. But I do think for a guy who's been healthy and hasn't really shown that the offense will change when he's hurt, because he has been hurt, I think it's got to be Jason Kelce.
Okay, so let's talk about this answer here. Let's talk about this answer here because I think it's like a great illustration of someone who's an expert, someone who has a lot of knowledge about something, clearly, like Mitchell Schwartz, former what was his deal? He never made it all pro or something like that, or he never made a Pro Bowl. I can't remember. It was one of those two things, even though despite the fact that PFF had him graded as like the best tackle, or giving up the fewest pressures at tackle multiple times. Now, it was a right tackle, so he didn't get as much credit as being a left tackle there. But anyway, someone who is a great expert in an area who does a poor job, in my opinion, at translating expertise to essentially what is a prediction. Okay. If you're saying, if the question is which team, suffers the most by not having X player, and this is a lot of like, everyone's kind of in the prediction business when it comes to NFL analysis in reality, because we're all like discussing things and what their impact will be or can be, or who a player is currently is kind of like, what do you think next week? What's going to happen? If you're doing quarterback rankings, it's kind of like, how well are these guys going to perform as quarterbacks, do you think? In a way. So this is very much a prediction because you're being asked, okay, let's a hypothetical situation. If you took player X out of the mix, what would have the biggest negative impact? So it's translating expertise to prediction where experts are generally very, very bad. And this is not just my opinion. It's been studied. Okay, Super Forecasters, the book Super Forecasters, if you haven't read it, one of the big takeaways is that experts are actually the worst at making predictions because they overvalue generally their slice of expertise. It's much more important to look at general base rates, have that be the foundation of what you're doing, not specifics. General base rates, that's the foundation of what you're doing. Then study how often things deviate from those base rates, and then make marginal choices and decisions off of those base rates to make a prediction about a particular thing. So what we have here is we have it flipped when it comes to what Mitchell Schwartz is talking about here. And this is what experts do. They flip things. The base rates, and not only like if you want to look at on-off splits, which are very noisy, and I kind of made fun of some of the Teron Armstead on-off splits that were being shared earlier this season as he got injured, before they played without his injury, because they were a little silly. They were based on 50-something plays from last season, Tua's performance with and without Teron Armstead. Most of those plays coming against the San Francisco 49ers in San Francisco. Even the Tyron Smith on-off splits, I think they're meaningful, but again, it's very noisy. So you don't want to read too much into it. Like, they're overstating the case. But you will find generally, and I found this looking at on-off splits for players, which help build up my, what I call NFL plus minus, my valuation metric. What you do find is generally the base rate, the underlying general truth is that tackles, when they're off of the field, when you lose them, provide a lot more value than guards. Guards actually provide a lot more value than centers. Okay, so that's your base rates. And the people in the book Super Forecasters who do the best job at making predictions, what they do is they're good at like studying how do you make a good prediction. How you make a good prediction is you rely heavily on the base rates. So it's not that a center couldn't be the most valuable player. Like, it's impossible that a center is the most valuable player, or a guard. It's just the evidence weighs heavily, heavily, heavily against that from a base rate perspective. So you need to have overwhelming knowledge about something, totally overwhelming knowledge, to have any confidence that it would be the case that it would not be a tackle. And we have a lot of great tackles in the NFL that you can choose from here, that it would not be a tackle in this game. That's just how it works. Overvaluing the unique circumstances and your unique knowledge. And in this case, definitely overvaluing the tush push thing, or the brotherly shove, or whatever you want to call it. Definitely overvaluing, like, I get it, they're converting it at a high rate, but part of their conversion rate over the NFL is probably luck, right? They probably just have more luck when they're doing it. And again, if you're talking about how they're able to convert better than the rest of the NFL, another part might just be they have a lot of practice doing it. They've been doing it and executing it for a while. So not specific to Jason Kelce. The third thing is like they're blocking generally. It's not just Kelce here. There's guards that are in there. There's tackles. There's guys pushing from the back. There's other people. So Kelce is like one of these factors. And the last thing is like Jalen Hurts, right? Jalen Hurts is 230 pounds, 6'2" or 6'1" or something like that. He's basically built like a running back. So if you're going to say, like, if you were just going to look at this and forget about looking at technique, forget about even knowing anything about Jason Kelce or Jalen Hurts as runners or blockers, if you're just going to look at them and say, let's compare Jason Kelce from a like physical ability standpoint to other centers in the NFL, what's the delta there in their abilities to execute a tush push, at least theoretically, just looking at them in their build and their size and their metrics and everything else versus Jalen Hurts and other quarterbacks? I mean, Jalen Hurts is a much bigger difference between him and most quarterbacks. I mean, there are other athletic quarterbacks in the NFL, but a 230-pound guy who's built like a running back is different, is higher up kind of like the distribution of who would be good at tush pushes than Jason Kelce is for other centers. So you have all that combined. So I just thought it was like a really, really good example here of how experts are very knowledgeable in what they know. It's very interesting that they could have an opinion on Kelce and how he fits into the scheme. But what they tend to do, and again, this is like, it's more exciting content, or it's more interesting content for people to hear a well-explained, counterintuitive take that goes against all that we know about, football value when it comes to these different positions. It's kind of interesting, but the reality is it's just probably not true. And it's very unlikely, very, very unlikely, and probably a very poor prediction on his point, or poor take on his point as to who would be taken away. Now, you might say, like, who when they're taken away has a bigger impact than you'd expect based upon their position. Yeah, you could go for Jason Kelce there. Then you go for Jason Kelce there. But if you're going to say like any offensive lineman, this and that, no, I'm sorry. There's just too much overwhelming evidence that it's not going to be the case for a center, even a center as great as just Jason Kelce. I mean, the guy's kind of near the end of his career too. So I'm sure he's still performing well. He's still very fast, everything else. But you're basically like saying this guy's been the best player in the NFL over the last 12 years or whatever he's been in. No, I'm sorry. I'm not buying it. So again, experts, very good at what they do, not so good at making predictions. But we often ask them as part of the content ecosystem here in the NFL. We often ask experts, former players, former coaches to make opinions, to have opinions on things that they haven't really studied, and they're not really like expert. They're not good at making predictions. And that's the content game. So again, when you see things like that, it's an interesting note. It's something to think about, but trust me, if, I don't know, Trent Williams or one of these great left tackles is missing from a game versus Jason Kelce, they're probably not any effect on like point spreads or things like that necessarily that much, but I would adjust, if you're going to make any micro adjustments to the numbers, I would do so more for Trent Williams than I would do for Jason Kelce, just based upon the evidence that we have. All right. Second thing, and I talked about this a lot in the adjusted quarterback efficiency numbers that I put out about rankings, quarterback rankings. I know it's a little bit like tedious, the quarterback ranking game. I mean, I got to get into it. I got to get into it too. Sorry. I apologize for everyone that I gotta get into it, but I think I do a good job of like coming up with actual like good content for this sort of stuff. So I have my adjusted quarterback efficiency rankings. I called it luck-based quarterback rankings because I've just been focused on that. I don't have open scores, which I was getting from ESPN to measure that sort of stuff. But I did add another element, the yards after catch, which it's interesting because there's been some people who've done work on this one. Name escapes me now, but I know someone has done work on Yak where it's mostly like a receiver thing as opposed to it's mostly a quarterback thing as opposed to receiver thing, a scheme quarterback thing as opposed to receiver thing. And it's highly variable. Now, I think there are certain guys like Deebo Samuel who you could probably say is like a Yak monster, guys who are good at forcing missed tackles or good at Yak. But there's an element of luck to that too. So I have my rankings where I'm adjusting for Yak over expectation based upon target location, drops, interceptions, defensive pass interference, fumble recovery, strength of schedule, and weather. So I look at all these things here. And the question has been like Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy's the guy. Where does he belong? This and that. So if he falls from being kind of head and shoulders above everyone else, being over half a point EPA per play versus Josh Allen, who is like 0.3 EPA per play. So that's a massive gap. Like it's as big of a gap as it is between Josh Allen and I don't know, someone who's in the 12th sort of 13th sort of range for EPA per play is the difference between 1 and 2. But when you adjust for all these different things, Purdy actually slots in a little bit below Allen. And Allen's kind of having like a sneaky good season this year, I think, because they're 3-2. They lost this game to the Jaguars, where I believe they were the fundamentally better team last week. He's been a bit sneaky there. So it kind of slots in Purdy between Mahomes, who again is having a not quite a Mahomesian sort of year, a little bit off year, and Josh Allen there with these adjustments. And again, that doesn't mean you have to like rank Purdy as the second best quarterback in the NFL, but it's at least a way to get like real context on how well he's played this season with some luck adjustments to it, some concrete luck adjustments to it, because and this is why I think and again, I have a table here at the end. Again, subscribe to unexpectedpoints.substack.com to get it. I have a table here which has the exact numbers for how much he's losing for yards after catch, advantage, interceptions, drops, fumbles. He's getting some big advantages here, and the total adjustment that's being made here. And you can also like theoretically look and say, well, if Purdy was actually, let's say, the 10th best quarterback in the NFL, how off would I have to be? Like, how many more expected points would he have to lower down? It's like, oh, he'd have to lower down by another, 15 expected points in different ways. And he's already, so much lower than everyone else. Tua second, losing 16 expected points added by all these adjustments. And Purdy is up around 35. So he's just like an enormous adjustment. So he definitely deserves an enormous adjustment. But just saying he deserves an enormous adjustment isn't enough to justify like any ranking. Okay. And I think that was the problem with what Steve Ruiz over at The Ringer was trying to do in his explanation for why his ranking last week was 25th on Purdy. It's 22nd now after that fantastic performance last week for Purdy. Like why he's there. He makes the argument of saying, okay, his accuracy hasn't been that great. He has just as many turnover-worthy throws as Jordan Love and Sam Howell, but those two have 12 interceptions and he has 0. I agree. Brock Purdy has not been as good as his numbers, but it's not like you don't make a compelling argument that he belongs ranked 22nd in the NFL by just proving he hasn't been as good as his numbers. Like that's not enough. You could be not as good as your numbers. You could be the number 1 efficiency quarterback in the NFL, not as good as your numbers, and still deserve the number 1 ranking. You could deserve the number 2 ranking. You could deserve the number 10 ranking. You could deserve the number 15 ranking. Like there's all kinds of rankings you can have. And again, I think a lot of the pushback with Purdy isn't that Ruiz isn't the concept that he hasn't been as good as his grading. I mean, or his numbers. I mean, I'm saying he's not as good as his numbers. Nobody's bothering me. It's that you're saying that he hasn't been as good of his numbers to such a degree that you still have him ranked below Ryan Tannehill, Derek Carr, Daniel Jones, and going into last week, lower than Mac Jones also. That's kind of the problem. But one thing I want to focus on here is like bad use of stats. Again, when you don't respect the stats like me, like I respect, maybe I put it on a pedestal. You put it on a pedestal, put the stats on a pedestal. Maybe I'm doing that a little bit too much. But I do think it's closer to the ground truth than a lot of people's opinions. But when you don't respect the stats, then you're willing to do kind of anything with the stats to make your point. And I think what Ruiz does here, whether conscious or not, is he's messing with the stats a little bit here. First of all, this explainer that he came out with that was published, and I'm using this as an example of what a lot of people do with stats, right? Not to say that Ruiz is unique in this, but he's publishing this on October 11th. So it's 2 days, or at least a day and a half after PFF had upgraded its grading. But yet he uses PFF's grading from the week before, before Purdy had this great game. So he says that Purdy was ranked 22nd in passing grade going into the Dallas game. So before the Dallas game. And he had him ranked at 25th. So, hey, not that big of a difference. Well, the problem is, if you look at this week's ratings after the game has happened, the most current thing, the differential is wider. PFF has him ranked 12th in passing grade versus Ruiz's ranking at 22nd. And if you look at his overall offensive grade, which includes his rushing value that he's brought and other things that he's brought, which presumably is part of Ruiz's rankings. Again, I think like Ruiz is probably using passing grade instead of offensive grade. maybe because it looks better for his analysis. Like there's at least the worry there. Purdy is 8th right now in his offensive grade. So it's really like 8th offensive grade for PFF. If you want to use PFF as like, look, PFF agrees with me. Well, no, PFF has him 8th in offensive grade this year versus your 22nd ranking after last week. Not that close. Now, just because he's been 8th this year doesn't mean you need to have him ranked 8th. But it is it's a weaker case. It's a weaker stats-based case than what you're trying to use in your explanation. I'll also say in his explanation, when he uses that 22nd passing grade, maybe this was an oversight, but he's not filtering out guys like Mike White who only have 2 dropbacks, and guys like Bailey Zappi who have 10 dropbacks. So like those 2 guys are ranked higher by this 22nd ranking. Is that an oversight, or are you messing with the stats a little bit there? Purposefully just adding everyone in there in order to get him 22nd instead of 20th, maybe. But anyway, I think this is like a clear example of maybe it's not totally nefarious use of stats here. Maybe there is just some oversight. Maybe he wrote this up before the week started, all that sort of stuff. But I mean, clearly the better comparison, if you want to talk about PFF grading, would have been his 8th ranked PFF offensive grade this week versus your 22nd ranking this week. So not 22nd versus 25th, where the 22nd was not even really 22nd, and it was only passing grade and not offensive grade, and it included guys with 2 dropbacks and everything else. So again, I think most of the bad use of stats often comes from people who try to downgrade the use of stats versus their eye test. But more importantly with this is like, you got to have a systematic way of figuring this out. You're not really going to convince that many people by just saying, hey, trust me, he's been worse than his numbers, so he belongs at X ranking. No, this is just not how it works. And that's something that you got to avoid in analysis, and why I try to be explicit about everything. But I have faults. So if you see any faults on my stuff, please let me know. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is this Luke before I get into any of the week 6 stuff. I'm just going to talk about week 6 briefly. I mean, I put it on there on the YouTube, but got to get those eyeballs. Is this Luke Bourne interview with Wharton Moneyball, the Wharton Moneyball podcast. So it's a podcast hosted by a few different professors over at the Wharton School of Business, although they are stats professors here also. I clipped something here, which I shall share, where it's Luke Bourne, and I thought this is the best part. So this is starting about 45 minutes into the episode. There's a lot of background stuff that he talks about, which is kind of interesting. But I think like the stuff that he talks about specifically about his ownership and what he's doing, there's a couple of tutors. So let me just go. So he's part of this thing called, I want to make sure I'm getting it correct here, Red Bird Capital, I believe. Red Bird Capital, yes. So is the investment firm that he's a part of. They're powered by this Zealous Analytics, which he also owns, co-owns with someone else. And if you look at Red Bird Capital, AC Milan is the big one now that they've had it for shorter amount of time. So for those who don't know, AC Milan is one of the big 3, I would say, teams in Serie A, so the top level Italian league. One of the big 3 teams there, probably the second biggest team next to Juventus historically. In Serie A. So, I mean, Napoli is pretty good now, but Napoli traditionally has not been that great. And they also, although it's not, is Toulouse still on here? Toulouse might not even, they might have had to divest from Toulouse. This thing happened. Toulouse was in the second tier. So Ligue 2, as they would say in France. They were part of the second tier league. They got promoted up to Ligue 1, which is Ligue 1, which is the top French flight league. And they won this like in-season tournament where it's a single elimination tournament between all the different French teams. They won, which puts them into one of the European tournaments. So now that they qualify for one of the European tournaments and AC Milan is also in the European tournaments, they could theoretically play each other. And I think that requires either ownership divestment or separating like firewalls between everything where Luke is no longer working with Toulouse at all in the French league, but it is with AC Milan. which is, again, a huge historic team. Used to be owned by Silvio Berlusconi. For those who know Berlusconi, former, is it president or prime minister over there? I'm not even sure. I think president of Italy, maybe prime minister of Italy. Before that, being a media magnate who moved on to that. R.I.P. I think he's passed away. For those who, whether he deserves R.I.P. or not, I'm sure people have different opinions on that. But anyway, he used to own AC Milan for a while. Again, big rivalry with Juventus over there. But anyway, so he's talking in this interview. I'm rambling here. He's talking in this interview about like different lessons he has. And he says one of the things he does is he doesn't watch the games live. He doesn't watch the games live. Instead, he wants to review the stats and get the ground truth, what he believes are closer to ground truth first, and then watch the game. So here's the let me share the clip that I shared on Twitter with y'all here.
There's a tremendous variety of ways that we can be biased when we're placing values on athletes on a pitch with all these sort of dynamics that are going on, all the emotions that are going on. And as much as possible, I'm trying to let the data be sort of the foundation, and then make sure that when we're actually watching the video and using our eye on top of it, primarily, by the way, not necessarily to like say to get something necessarily on top of the data, but oftentimes we're sort of watching it to say, is there ways that the data could be misleading here? Mm-hmm. Well, but for the most part, you want to be doing that in as rational a state as possible.
Okay, so that was the clip where he's talking about it. I thought it was interesting too that he said like the main benefit of watching the game isn't necessarily to say you're learning a whole lot about like what happened versus the game, getting the context on it, but instead for him, for someone who's really trying his hardest to refine and has this team of people constantly working on the data metrics, is to say, oh, like what's happening that we might be missing in the data. And it doesn't like change our opinion necessarily on what happened in the game, but it's like our methodology for collecting and analyzing and producing insights from the data may be off. And that's what you're getting from it, but still getting that ground truth from the game. And I thought it was really, really interesting because he's talking about certain plays like stick out in our mind a lot. And again, third down plays, I would say for the NFL, stick out in our mind a lot as far as influencing our opinion on how overall successful a team has been or not. But we might ignore all these successful plays they had where if they just failed to convert on these third downs that are high leverage and kill drives, where in the reality is like, you know what, they were actually okay. They just couldn't convert these third downs. But in our minds, those highly charged, highly emotional plays, high leverage plays are going to stand out much, much more. So I thought that was really, really interesting. He has another part in the interview. And I don't know. I was going to try to actually find it, but I don't want to search through here because I don't have it clipped off. But basically, I thought it was a really interesting thing where he's talking about like what sort of edge, what's the best edge that you can get. And he kind of says something which is really funny where he says, well, you know, good luck is like always the best edge. Now, it's not an edge that you can necessarily harness and work towards, but it's kind of like that truism of you'd rather be lucky than good. He agrees with that, and I agree with that. And I think that's just respecting the value of luck. Most people just actually don't give enough credit to luck. So you might think it's weird that an analyst would say that your biggest edge is luck, something you can't control, but that's really just having humility, honestly. Like, no matter what sort of edges that you could produce from an analytical standpoint and add to a team, it's not going to have as big of an impact as luck for a team. And luck can last a season, luck can last 2 seasons, luck can last 3 seasons. Good luck versus bad luck. That's going to be the most important determinant of results, is luck. Thing is, you can't control luck. So the things you can control, that's what we have to focus on here. But I did think it was interesting that at least he recognized and said explicitly, like, if there's one edge that I could have, I would want to have the luck edge. If I could have any edge possible, even though it has nothing to do with my work, what I can control, everything else, like I would rather have the luck edge than anything else in terms of winning more and having better results. And that's undoubtedly true. And you have to respect variance. Another thing, respecting your lack of control is part of being an analytical thinker. All right. Let's actually get into the rest of week 6 here. I have my numbers that I've cranked via Power Rankings. You can get the Power Rankings data from the Google subscriber sheet for unexpected points, or you can kind of like look at the visualizations I have in my Power Rankings article every week and try to figure out what's going on there. So what I end up doing in this one is I have the spread that I'm pulling here, which is hopefully correct on NFL Faster, versus my estimations for the value of these teams, point differential value over an average team on a neutral field. I make home field adjustments. They adjust slightly based upon the location, but not a whole lot. Mine is still, between like 0.8 and 0.14 points, I would say. Maybe that's too much by some people's estimation. Some people think home field advantage is gone. I don't believe so. But anyway, travel, other things come into play in there. But it's not a huge deal there. And of course, you have neutral field like Tennessee and Baltimore this week, where Tennessee is putatively the home team, but they're not actually the home team in London. And then I compare those differentials versus the spread. You got to look at outcome distributions based upon being around what are actual scores, like moving a half a point from 2.5 to 3 to 3.5 is a much bigger deal than from than a pick to half a point to 1 point and so on. And then try to compare them and say, what might be interesting? What are we missing here? Maybe in the market. And again, the market can be very different from public perception also. So the first thing that jumps out, of course, is the Browns-Niners game, but no Deshaun Watson. So these are really tough to figure out. Now, Dorian Thompson-Robinson is not going to start. It looks like it's going to be PJ Walker or Philip Walker. I don't know what he wants to go by at this point. So what does that mean? I don't know. I mean, it's a 10 points. San Francisco's favored by 10 points in Cleveland. I'm a little bit lower on San Francisco and a little bit higher on Cleveland generally. And that doesn't really have to do with my highness on highness. I don't know if that works there. My elevated opinion of the Browns is not really Watson related necessarily. It's slightly Watson related. So him being gone there, I would have this spread like 2.5 points, maybe 3 points, conservative 3 points, San Francisco 3 points if Watson was playing. So is Watson worth a touchdown? Is he worth 7 points? Over PJ Walker? Maybe. I mean, Walker, he hasn't been in the system for that long, this and that. They just kind of brought him in and elevated him. Maybe. I don't know. It's kind of a toss-up, but I might still like the Browns a little bit there, honestly, as 10 point, just because I'm a little bit of a hater when it comes to the Niners and how good they are. It's funny. You have a lot of people who were like, you got to have the Niners number 1 team in the NFL, blah, 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 blah. And then they'll also be very skeptical of Brock Purdy. It's like, pick a side, buddy. It kind of matters how skeptical you are or not of Brock Purdy. Also playing on the road, playing in Cleveland, I think it'll be interesting to see how well Brock Purdy plays in these conditions. Okay, going back to London. So the line is 4 points for Baltimore. I'm low on Baltimore, but I'm kind of low on Tennessee too this year. My adjusted spread would be more like 2 points. So, or 2.5. So it is above the 3 that I would have it at. That 3 is a big demarcation there. I'm not really happy though about their approach to this game when it comes to the Titans and the Ravens, because the word on the streets is that the Ravens have been there since Tuesday, I think, and Tennessee is like flying in now. Well, what you doing there, guys? You got to acclimate. Acclimation is important. Probably helped the Jaguars, the fact that they had been in London for a full week. They played back-to-back games versus the Bills. That's probably an underplayed point in that game, although I think the Bills were kind of better anyway. So I don't know. I wouldn't go either way on this, but my numbers, just the pure numbers without factoring in this travel irregularity, which I may be overweighting, says take the Titans in the points. What else we got here? Chicago Bears? I don't know. They're 3-point underdogs at home against the Vikings. No Justin Jefferson, which is probably overrated in some people's minds, but not by the spread, it doesn't seem. I don't know. I can't. That's gross. Okay. Panthers, this is also gross. 13.5-point underdogs to the Dolphins. Holy Lord. So the thing about the Dolphins kind of interesting is that Tua's been low-key not great the last couple of weeks. Their success rate, while very, very, very high, is not nearly as high as their efficiency. Their rushing efficiency is like 7th, 8th in the NFL by passing. So they're so much better. They're number 1 in rushing efficiency, but they're so good that they would be like the 7th best passing offense in the NFL based on their rushing efficiency. I mean, Devon Achane, what that matters or not, him being there, I don't know necessarily. Maybe just give more to Mostert. Maybe he can hold up if Mostert gets injured. Then I think there are some problems there. Jeff Wilson Jr. has been pretty good. He can step in there. But just naturally, they're not going to continue at that sort of level. So I think Miami, while they're pretty high up in my rankings, not high enough to justify that type of point spread. And I think Panthers, I don't know, Bryce Young's turning the ball over a lot, which is not good with the low upside of that offense. But I think he's been, okay versus maybe some people's opinion of him so far this year. So I'm intrigued, but it's one of those games where, 13.5 is a college football type of spread. So I'm not getting too into it. What else do we have here? Okay, I can't do Bills Giants. I'm not touching that one because that's 14.5. Yikes. These spreads are so big that my numbers always love these college football spreads, betting on the underdogs. Anything else? Oh boy, this one is so gross. Jets, Eagles. So 7. Is there 7.5 available out there? Let me look at this one here. Gotta find if there's a 7.5 available here. Maybe I could plug my nose and bet the Jets in this one, because that would be it doesn't look like there are any 7.5s out there. It's all 7s across the board. So I don't know. Jets +7 at home. I mean, I hate Zach Wilson. He's horrible, but Philly is kind of like rounding into form. But their defense, I don't know. The Jets defense is definitely legit. And I think the Philly defense, while they got some sacks there at the end of the game, I don't know if they're quite as good as people think. So maybe I'm a little bit lower on Philly than some others. And I don't know if everything's been turned around after a couple of good performances. But that would be the other one that I would look at. But I'm not excited, though, about that one either. All right, I'm going to let everyone go. Hopefully you enjoyed some of the rants here, some of the reviews, some of the, for recreational purposes only, bets that I might be sprinkling this weekend. You got any questions for me? Hit me up on Twitter at Kevin Cole _. Of course, subscribe to unexpectedpoints.substack.com. Otherwise, I'll be back on the channel here live streaming Monday morning to review all of the week 6 action. Enjoy the weekend, everybody. Take it easy.